And when you mash all four of these together, no wonder prioritization conversations are some of the swirliest,
So wacky.
weirdest,
Yeah.
unproductive conversations I've ever seen in organizations.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the show. I'm Rodney Evans, and that guy is Sam Sperlin.
Hello, Rodney Evans.
Hello, Sam. Welcome back to At With Work. What's this podcast called? Welcome. You said whiskey. Okay. Welcome back to At Work with the Ready. This is a podcast about modernizing organizations as the future of work collides with the present moment.
Each episode, we turn our attention to one common organizational pattern that we think is worth digging into, and then we pull it apart, like my wife pulling the crust off a piece of pizza and calling it a breadstick. And we propose solutions for what to do instead.
I love this for Emily. That's amazing. This week we're talking about prioritization because y'all, you need it. We all need it. We need it so bad right now. But before we do that, we gotta prioritize a check-in, Sam?
We sure do. And Ronnie, I want to know, what's a molehill you're currently willing to defend until the end? And I'm happy to go first because this is one maybe requires a little bit of thinking. Here's my molehill. The expiration date on a yogurt, you can go a couple days beyond it. Like, they are so conservative about putting expiration dates on things that as long as you're within like a day or two and it smells okay, you're good to go. Don't throw it away. Just eat it.
First, can I just ask a question about whether there are two colloquialisms inside of this check-in round? Is this like the hill you can die on and making a mountain out of a molehill in one question?
Yeah. Is this not a normal phrase? Did I just accidentally make it up?
No. Yeah. Nobody says, what's a molehill you'll defend until the end.
Yeah.
It's like,
Well, get on my
what's
level,
the hill you'll
Rodney.
die on?
Get on my level.
I don't think I can. I'm not really sure. Okay, I don't think it's a molehill because I feel like molehills are small and this is
Okay.
kind of big.
Okay.
We don't need billionaires.
All the billionaire listeners of this podcast just turned it off, Rodney. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I feel fine about it. If they could just stay tuned to hear me say, give your money to someone who needs it or an organization that needs it before you tune out, that would be great. I've been seeing this statistic that says like the bottom 60% of Americans can't have a reasonable quality of life, even if they're fully employed. Which is a fancy way of saying the majority of employed Americans cannot have a reasonable standard of life. And I'm just like, no one needs $1 billion.
Yeah.
People should be rich. I think that's great. Have $50 million. Have $100 million. That's cool.
I mean, even 500 million is less than $1 billion. That's a lot of money.
That's so much money. Nobody needs more money than that. And I don't see a use case where that's not true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm just going to keep banging on about no more billionaires. It's stupid and they're making the world worse in every way.
Agreed. And really appreciating the just the dichotomy of expired yogurt and no more billionaires. I feel like that really encapsulates this podcast in some way that I can't really put my finger on.
It's the macro and the micro, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a parallel to be drawn that we're both too tired to make right now.
Totally.
All
right. I'm so checked in. Rodney, what the heck are we doing today? What's the pattern we're doing? It's been a minute since we've done a pattern episode because we did depth finding for a while. And then you talked to MBS and I wasn't there and I was very sad about it. And now we have like back to our original sort of structure.
Back to our roots. Although I will say, as a public service announcement, I'm not going to not use depth finding words because now I can't not use them when I go to make this episode. So we're going to talk about these patterns, but it's still going to come up. So just everybody strap in. But in our last depth finding episode, I talked about how I wanted to tackle prioritization because I feel like all of us are overwhelmed by the world right now in some way. And it is quite difficult when the zone is so flooded, and there's so much uncertainty to determine what to prioritize. The pattern that I see a lot, and I'm curious if this sort of squares with what you're seeing, is this. When the world is changing as fast as it is, it's quite difficult to focus. We are responding again and again and again as there's new stimulus from the environment, and we're often confusing recency and urgency.
Mhm.
And as a result of that, priorities keep getting added, resources are spread too thin, and as a result of that, the ROI on priorities isn't there, which leads to adding priorities. It's just this
Mhm.
vicious cycle of doing more and getting less and doing more and getting less.
Yeah.
And that's really what I want to dig into today because I think the impulse is very natural. And also, I don't think it's serving very well right now.
I completely agree. Let's dig in. I think this is a very prevalent pattern now, and I think I was going to say before. I don't know what the before is that I'm actually thinking of because things have always been complex and kind of chaotic out in the world, but somehow feels particularly so right now. So yeah, let's figure out. Like, let's fix priorities for people. Let's do it.
Let's fix it. So, when we started talking about this episode, you had some very interesting references, and I think we should start there. So, my first question to you is what is the job of prioritization? Or what are the jobs of prioritization? Let's just baseline with a
Sure.
definition.
I mean, I think like a lot of words that we sometimes use in this work, and I'm thinking of complex, complicated, like we all think we have the definition of the thing and like what it's actually talking about. But once you
Mm.
sit down and start to pick at it a little bit, you realize that there is a lot of complexity hidden inside of that word. So I think
Mhm.
prioritization, priorities are the same sort of experience. And I think there's this great article from John Cutler where he laid out kind of the four jobs of prioritization, and I really agree with it. So keep listening. Also, we'll link to the article, but keep listening. I'm going to do my best to summarize what he kind of looks at it or what he sees as the four jobs of prioritization. So one, it's about efficiency. So when
Mm.
we're talking about efficiency related priorities, you hear things like, what can I drop, delegate, or delay? I don't need a new priority. I just need help reducing the noise. Like that is one way we talk about priorities within organizations or within like an individual trying to figure out what to work on. That is different from number two, leverage and effectiveness. So, in this flavor of prioritization, you're hearing things like, are we placing bets in the right places or are we just being busy? I don't want to just do things well. I want to do the right things. And ideally, that those things unlock value. So, this is about, are
Mhm.
we doing kind of the right things? And we do the right thing that gives us much more leverage. Cool. Different than the first thing, but yet we would probably use prioritization for that sort of conversation as well. Third
Sure.
one, alignment and autonomy. So these are conversations about things like, I know that I can make decisions, but I'm not confident that I see the bigger picture. I'd feel more comfortable making calls without escalating everything if we had shared context and clearer sense of direction. Also a flavor of prioritization. I'm on a team, just tell me what the priorities are and I'll make sure that thing gets done. And then the
Yep.
last one, support, funding, and commitment. So these are conversations where we're actually talking about resources being deployed. What are we prioritizing from a budget perspective, from a headcount perspective? And that also is often talked about as prioritization, or we need to make something a
Mhm.
priority. And when you mash all four of these together, no wonder prioritization conversations are some of the swirliest,
So wacky.
weirdest,
Yeah.
unproductive conversations I've ever seen in organizations.
Right. That's
How did
so
these hit you?
interesting.
Do you see this as well?
I do, but what's interesting is I wouldn't have necessarily parsed out all 4 of them until you
Mhm.
said it, and then I'm like, "Oh, this does make a lot of sense." Um,
Yeah.
I think about prioritization as, like, the filter of from everything we could do, what we're gonna do, but that is
Yeah.
one view on it, and
Yeah.
there are
Yeah.
definitely these other views that are really interesting, and I see the way that they work together. It's like, if you want to have less but better, you wanna have reduced cognitive load and high focus, you want your workforce working on, the most high value things for your end users or whatever,
Yeah.
presumably, that gets you more leverage, that gets you more alignment, that gets you clarity around how you allocate resources, but you could almost start from any of those 4 points as the on-ramp and
Yep.
work your way back to the other ones.
Totally, yeah, and not to make this the John Cutler pod, he digs into that a little bit. Like, you can take these in different orders, and depending on your kind of strategic situation or your context, various ones make different sense. If you're like in a software development team and you're totally locked up with overwhelming amount of stuff to do, maybe the first focus of your prioritization effort is actually just like clearing some things out, just like figuring out
Mhm.
some things that you don't have to do, or yeah, just creating space. And once you have space, you
Yeah.
can be more deliberate about what is the highest leverage thing. Whereas in a totally different scenario, maybe as like a senior leadership team where we're not really talking about like cranking widgets, it
Right.
maybe we should be focused more on the leverage sort of job of prioritization.
Yeah. I mean, you're tapping right off the bat on something that I think is really important in prioritization that I wanna talk about, which is why people don't ever wanna stop doing things. It
Yeah,
is. It's so rough to shut something down in a
yeah,
company. And I really want to talk about why, because everybody says, like, I used to say all the time, like, start by stopping, and I've stopped saying
yeah,
it because nobody can do it.
yeah,
And I even see this at the ready where, like, a team that's really humming around like an internal mission or something will sort of finish the mission and be like, "What's next?" And it's like, "No, dude,
no,
it's
you're done, you
over.
did it.
You're done." And, like,
Yeah,
I am a really big fan when you have a cross-functional team in pursuit of a priority, when it is accomplished, of disbanding no matter what,
yeah,
even if that very same team is reassembled around a different mission
yeah,
in a week, I'm like, "Stop, just stop, like,
yeah,
full stop things." Why doesn't
yeah.
anybody wanna do that, and why doesn't anybody do that?
It's a great question, and I was kind of chuckling as you were talking because in my personal life, like non-work, I love stopping things. Not having to do a thing is like that sounds
Mm,
great.
yeah,
And I'm trying to think about what's the difference between like that and then a work context. I think in a lot of organizations, so much identity is wrapped up in the things that you are working on. And
yeah,
in some ways, stopping the thing that you are owning or contributing to is like it's like a little death. It's like a little
yeah,
corporate death.
it
And
is.
that's scary, especially if you are working in an organization where it could literally not literally die, but like your job goes away potentially.
Right,
Like if there's not
right.
this like role fluidity that we talk about in more progressive organizations where it's not a big deal if the thing that you're working on goes away because you're just going to pick up another thing. There are lots
Right,
of organizations where if your thing goes away, you go away. So of
right.
course nobody wants to admit to themselves, even though they probably or admit to the organization, even though they can admit to themselves that the thing I'm working on is not a priority. It probably should be stopped, but I'd like to keep getting a paycheck and feed my
Yeah,
family. So like let's keep the charade going.
let's keep this up. Yeah. You know, I think that's a very reasonable take. There's also something that maybe is a little bit more, like, murky under this that I notice, which is when we're doing something that probably we don't need to do anymore, is probably could be deprioritized because it's not, getting the return that we think it should for whatever reason. I think it's very easy to say, like, "Oh, well, we'll stop doing that and we'll reinvest that energy or money or human attention in something else." And that feels, I feel like very cognitively, like, sound thinking. But I think
Mhm.
the lived experience of that is much more like, I'm swapping something that I know how to do for something that I have to learn how to do.
Yeah.
And the space between I'm on a team or I'm working on a thing that I know how to do and is really humming and that I'm certain about, regardless of the impact that it's having, I know how to do
Sure.
the job. The difference between that and like now there's like a really significant flash to bang between when I start this new adventure and when anything happens. I've had enough sort of like personal experience and experience with teams where they're like, so we're basically giving up a sure thing, even if it's ineffective, for a novel thing that could be ineffective.
Right.
And I just think that's a hard sell.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. I mean, there's an element of kind of sunk cost fallacy, everyone's
Yes,
favorite fallacy. The one
totally.
fallacy everyone knows, sunk
Yeah,
cost fallacy, because I think we can all
we do
we've all
because
felt
we
it.
feel it. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah,
really
and I think
interesting.
it's so interesting too because I think you can even take something like complexity and like the idea that an organization is a complex adaptive system and use that as justification why we should keep doing a thing
Right,
forever. Like, well, we don't know
right.
what could happen. Like this thing could lead to the next thing that we really want to do. Like why would we close off kind of the why would we reduce the surface area to serendipity for like a thing that we're doing as an organization? Like I think that's a flawed argument, but I can see how you could make it.
This leads to something I wanted to talk to you about, which is I feel like, corporate America, we're just like very binary beasts. It's like everybody's favorite trap to just be
Yeah.
like success or failure. Like there's only winning and losing and there's nothing else. And
Yeah.
we talk about the third way a lot in this podcast, but I think in prioritization to your exact point, Sam, it's like what I don't often see when say a mission is prioritized and there's a cross-functional team assembled about it around it is like what would the signals of progress be so that before we get close to the end, we know whether we're on
Yeah.
to something or not. And to your point, I think in complexity, it can be very easy to like manufacture signals of progress or to get
Sure.
wedded to things that are like ultimately not really going to lead to outcomes. It can get very murky. And I think all of us are really good at gathering evidence for why what we're doing is valuable and important. And it
Yeah.
can make it easy to justify continuing to do things even when we're like overworked and we're burnt out and we're worried about the risk of dropping it and. Um,
Yeah.
I just think it feels easier to pile on than to shed.
Totally agree. And I think underneath that is this unstated assumption, which may be just cultural to kind of the US and maybe more broadly, but definitely in the US, which is uh, the success condition for anything, a project, a product, an organization, a company is forever. Like you
Right.
do the thing forever, or else you are a failed organization, or you have a
Right.
failed product, or you have a failed initiative. And there are very few, maybe zero things that should exist forever from like
Yeah.
the drop of the hat. So maybe we can get a little bit more realistic about, well, what would actually be successful here? Like maybe this thing won't exist forever. And maybe we put a end date on it at the very beginning. Or to your point,
Right.
we get really clear about what kind of signal we're looking at that tells us whether to keep it going or not. But there
Yeah.
seems to be this yeah, this like if you don't do something forever, it's a failure. Like, well, then why would any of us stop anything and have to like look at ourselves in the mirror and see a failure?
I think that's exactly right. And I also think it's really easy to confuse like good work for impactful work. I see a lot of projects happen in client organizations and it's like it's it's not that the work that they're doing isn't high quality. It's not that it's not
Right.
compelling in some way. It's just that it's not necessarily having the impact or getting the outcome that they want. And I think when you're prioritizing, like, you really have to parse those things. Like, obviously, having impact and not having a high bar doesn't feel great in terms of like the work product. But
Mhm.
having a high bar and not having impact is just as bad. It's probably
Yeah.
worse, actually.
Yeah.
If you
Yeah.
can get the result but do a shite job, like, that's probably better actually than having, like, your beautiful mind palace of knowledge work that nobody gives a shit about.
Yeah.
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 But, like, I don't feel like we often when we're talking about prioritization, I think it can be hard to separate those things and to be like, "But what is this priority doing for us? And
Right.
and did it do the job? What is the job
Yeah.
of this priority, and did the work do that job?"
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, that's just going back to, we listed out 4 different jobs of priorities at the
Right.
very beginning. And yeah, perhaps there's some nuance there that we can just all start to bring to conversations that we are in around priorities, whether it's our own individual priorities in our life,
Yeah.
or our team, or maybe for the strategy of an organization. And that is actually something that I wanted to bring up. Is that, do you think it matters, or how does it matter to think about, kind of like the elevation that you are at in an organization with
Mm.
priorities? 'Cause that's the other thing that always kind of breaks my brain about priorities. Like, are we talking about me looking at my task list for the day and being like, there's 30 things here and I'm going to do maybe 10? Like, how am I going to prioritize those? Versus a C suite looking at their 5-year strategy and being like, all right, well, what are our priorities here? What are we going to tell the rest of the organization our priorities are? And then anywhere kind of in between that very high and very low level.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I'm curious for your take. I think that, my sort of lazy answer to this is I think there's too much focus on alignment of priorities and not enough focus on like coherence. So I
Yeah.
think that if you're on the executive team, your job is real clarity around what is being pursued, whether that is and what is being pursued and how? I'm not a big fan
Mhm.
of seeing executive teams just like publish a single metric as the priority for the year because it just doesn't tell us a lot about like how we're going to get that or what it's going to mean for our organization or why it's that number and not something else. I
Mhm.
understand why that is the go to, but I ultimately don't think it's ideal. But even as I say that, I do think that executive teams that can say very clearly, like, it's these three things and not these three things for this year is incredibly helpful for the rest of the organization to either on an individual level, on a team level, be thoughtfully contributing directly to one of those things or to be thoughtfully experimenting divergently from one of those things, but
Right.
not to be doing stuff that is not the three things.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Or said another way, not to be doing the stuff that the executive team has said, not
We're
these
not
three.
gonna do. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like, those were to not do the 3 from last year. And it's like,
Totally.
I think divergence and prioritization is really helpful at a team level, and especially when you have big systems. I think the fractal nature of this really comes into play. But what I often see is actually something in between, which is at the top level, there's clear new priorities. At the team level, there's lagging work from old priorities, and there's neither focus on the current nor intention around divergence. I think that's
Yeah.
kind of the worst of all worlds.
Yeah. Totally agree with you there. And it was making me think, and here's a spot that Jack is gonna have to edit because I have a thing on the tip of my tongue and I've lost it, about,
Is it
something
like
you were
about the
saying.
molehill question?
No, it was a really thoughtful build on what you were just saying there, but
Mm,
it just kind of, exited my very pained, brain right now. It'll probably come back around.
it'll come back. Don't worry about it. Just let it
Yeah.
be and then it'll
Oh,
pop
oh,
back.
I think
There it
I kind of
is.
remember. I think I kind of remember. Or this was like one of a couple of things, that I was thinking about. No, I can't figure out the segue into back into it. Woo!
Ju
We're
I
crushing it today.
We're so
Anyway,
tired.
we
Okay.
really are. We're
Yeah.
hey, we're putting in yeoman's effort here.
Really
Um,
trying.
the, I think the thing that I wanted to say to build on this is that on the one hand, I don't know that there's a huge difference in the, like, psychological experience of, like, an organization setting priorities for itself and an individual figuring out what they're gonna do for the day, and the thing that is interesting to me about
Mhm.
the individual being really clear on their own prioritization is I feel like that muscle can be cultivated in the solo work of figuring out like what am I doing and not doing today or
Yeah.
this week. And I think that muscle can be redeployed in larger venues with your team, with the team of teams that you are a part of, with a leadership team if you are on it. I just don't see how, if you have a bunch of individuals on a leadership team who can't prioritize for shit in their personal life or on their individual level, suddenly being good at it as a team seems like that's not gonna, like, that math ain't mathin'.
Right.
So at the very least, I think there's an interesting bill or interesting task in front of all of us to figure out what does it look like to get good at this as just people. If you have any
Yeah.
sort of autonomy over what you're doing every day, and you're not just not that there's anything wrong with this, but like kind of giving tickets that tell you what your next priority is. If you have to exercise some volition to figure out what the next thing is, I think there's a lot of room for most of us to get better about being deliberate around that.
I love that. And to just like take the sort of other end of the spectrum in terms of the team, the sort of like leadership team level, sometimes when I see leadership teams working on prioritization, what it looks like is each functional leader just naming their two and it becoming like a grocery list of the
Yep.
15 total. It's like
Yeah.
there's 5, everybody's got 3, we've got 15. I think we're good.
Right.
Um
It was hard for me to come
and
up with my 3, so therefore this is a real prioritization list, even though
you're like,
now
I
there's
narrowed it
15.
down from 11, so that
Yeah.
feels good. Um,
Yeah.
and I think that the work of not just a leadership team, like I think there's obviously leadership at a lot of levels, but I think to get the kind of coherence that we're talking about, the design work, the OS work that's required is to like, okay, look at the 15 and think, what are the 3 things that these materially add up to?
Yeah.
And if of the 15, 7 of them don't have anything to do with those 3, kill them. There's something that happens in terms of capacity where, like, to your point of, like, the math doesn't math, where when every functional leader says, "We can get after all of this," and then the leadership team says, "Okay, that means it's all of this." Operationally, it's not.
Yeah.
They always think that there's more capacity than there
And there
is,
is.
and there's always I don't know if this is because, a lot of leadership teams that are setting strategies aren't in the operational day-to-day, or they don't fully understand the sort of like splooginess that exists in their orgs and what it requires to actually do something. But I'm sure you've had this experience. Like I've worked with so many sort of like D-level people in companies who are just like, these dudes do not know what it takes to do the thing that they
Yeah.
said to do. Like, they think
Yeah.
this is just like you can like flip a switch on. This is like 6 months of work for like a team of 10. And like they
Yeah.
have no like and that team of 10 has day jobs. Like there's just like a little bit of a disconnect I think from reality sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it makes me wonder then, well, what's the answer? Is that leadership gets a better, deeper, like, technical understanding? I mean, yeah, maybe, like, maybe it wouldn't hurt, but also I don't think we necessarily want all the C-suite leaders, like, going, like, back into the trenches and learning all the latest stuff. It makes
Definitely.
me think, well, maybe then the answer is that actually that means that that leadership team is setting priorities at the wrong level. If they're
Yeah.
getting down kind of like into that level of specificity, I wonder if what does it look like to be one level up from that about kind of what are the general bets that we are setting, and then let the folks who really have the technical expertise really figure out like what part of that they can get after, or what it looks like to get after like a certain slice of that, rather than just like making shit up and declaring it so as if that is what it takes to actually make things happen.
I love that. I also wanted to talk about, while we're sort of on the steering thing,
Mhm.
I also think there's the other version of this, which you mentioned, and I was really like my curiosity was really piqued because it just felt intuitively like so right on that there is a difference between like, we're big advocates for continuous steering,
Yeah.
and it doesn't mean not prioritizing. And we just talked about what not to do in terms of, like, just creating the ever-growing list of boxes to be checked that are not tethered to reality in any meaningful way. So what is the continuous steering version of
Yeah.
this?
That's a great question, and I put it on our board here not because I had any answers, but I was hoping maybe you had some. But I'll take a swing,
Take a swing.
at this because I do think it is there's a world where you look at, us talking about continuous steering and you're basically saying like, what? So you just kind of like at the whims of things happening around you, like change the course of action that you're on. And obviously that's not what we mean by continuous steering, but I think it's harder to give kind of a positive definition of it. Where I'm kind of landing in this moment is that when I think about continuous steering on an initiative or in a strategy, it's the continuous part is more on the, like, sense making, and then the slight modifications that often that sense making, kinda is pointing at. So in so I don't think continuous steering is like, first we're going hard to the left, and like, "Oh, shit, now we're going hard to the right." The continuous steering
Right.
is happening in a more gradual way, and it's a lot when you're making those continuous steering movements over a long period of time, you can move really far. I mean, think about it, riding a bike or driving a boat and slight modifications over a long period of time. Like you are well in a different direction than you were originally, but only having to make slight adjustments along the way. I think that's where I land right now. And what that means for priorities is that we're not like throwing our priorities out every quarter and starting from a blank piece of paper. We are
Mhm.
starting with what we have, incorporating new information that we have learned over the course of that quarter or whatever the time frame is, stuff from the sky, but also stuff that we have learned in the pursuit
In
of those
pursuit.
priorities.
Yep.
We have learned what is working, what isn't working, a better way to get after a thing. We incorporate that into our prioritization, and now we are on a slightly different course. And doing
Mhm.
that over time, I think leads to better outcomes. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. I like
Different take
that.
or yeah.
I don't think it is a different take, but what you're making me think of is, I wish that priorities were named as hypotheses.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, I just think that, I was talking to someone who was a former client a little while ago, and there's a strategic requirement to increase number of users of the product, which is
Mhm.
not terribly uncommon in this
No.
here
If you got a
capitalism.
product and you
We
sell
need
it to
more
people, we
people
want more
to
of them.
buy it. Yeah, it turns out it's a tale as old as time. And there are some real like flaws in the basic functionality of this product. I say this because when you need to have more users, there are a variety of levers that you can pull, right? Like you can do more marketing, you can lower the pricing, you can create incentives, you can do all manner of things. You can buy your competitors. There's lots and lots of moves out there in the playbook that you can try doing. And this particular leader who I was speaking with was like, I am taking the perspective that if we basically shored up the fundamental
Yeah.
functionality of this product, it would solve our problem. And that we should do less on legal, sales, marketing, pricing, ops, whatever, and do more on what is essentially the infrastructure of the product so that customers hate it less. This to me,
May maybe even like it at some point.
we'll
We're
see.
shooting for the stars.
Yeah, right. Aim high. This to me is like a, a very provocative and interesting hypothesis phrase or priority phrase as a hypothesis. Because the
Mhm.
priority on its own would just be more customers. But the hypothesis is we believe we can get more customers through a better user experience with our core functionality. So we're going to focus there. And one of the things that both you and I talked about in the prep for this is and to your point about steering, like sometimes things like that take time. And I think
Mm,
in
yeah,
publicly held companies, there's so much pressure to like meet earnings expectations and to report quarterly. And, if you have a large organization and you have a large footprint, like your customers might not notice an increase in quality within a quarter, and that might not translate to better NPS and more
yeah,
users in a quarter. That doesn't mean that the hypothesis is wrong, though. And
yeah,
so I just feel like, and it also doesn't mean it's the only one. Like if we play out this scenario, maybe you also have a hypothesis around pricing. Maybe you also have a hypothesis around breaking into a new region. Maybe you also have a hypothesis about a new feature. But like, I sort of like the idea of testing priorities as hypotheses because it feels easier to steer that way than just saying, like,
yeah.
take that hill, go fucking take it.
Yeah. Well, and I think I love what you just said there, and I think to add a little bit to it, having hypotheses that have different payoff windows. So some
Mhm.
of those payoff windows
Yes.
are quarterly, and we do expect things to happen quarterly, and they're not our only part. They're not the like the entirety of our bet portfolio. We do
Yeah.
have some of these larger bets, and I think pairing the larger bets with the shorter bets takes a lot of the pressure off of those longer term bets. We can admit what they are. We know that they're not going to change anything in the quarter, and we're not asking them to do that, and yet we still think they are important.
I love that. And it also relates to like something else I thought about, which is just, in prioritization, you're going to have stuff that's like incremental and you're going to have stuff that's innovative. And I think what's important about what you just said is like there's the time scale and then there's sort of the significance of
Yeah,
the priority. And just being really clear that you're placing bets on both. And
yeah,
like that not all of our bets are just on short-term incremental buoys because those things, they're not necessarily bad ideas. And also, it's very easy to mortgage the long term for the short term. And also, it's very easy to have too many people doing too many small things that get sort of lost in the fog of war and don't ultimately
yeah,
add up to anything. But I
yeah,
think just like the mindset of like, what is the time scale? What is the effort? What is the impact? Is really useful and also might be related to the prioritization rubric that I want to talk about. I can't remember
yeah,
anymore what the factors are, but it's something like that. It's something
yeah.
like I just think all teams for our own sanity need to understand what variables we're considering when we're prioritizing.
Totally. It's just all coming back to that idea of that prioritization is a nuanced thing. We should be very careful about just calling something a priority with no explanatory text of like what actually we're talking about. And when you start to pull apart the different elements of it, as you just did, we get to just be much more precise about what it is that we're actually talking about. What do we expect to happen? And when we have that greater nuance, that allows us to do that continuous steering better because we have more things that we're looking at other than good or bad, worked
Right.
or no. Like, well,
Right.
no, there are gradations of gray across like three or four different criteria that we can get signal from and decide what that means for the overall package of the priority itself.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
All right. I feel us
I
pushing against the
think
edge of wanting to like
me
talk about some like
too.
things to
We
do
wanna
instead.
do it. Yeah,
We want to make it better.
let's do the ideas to help people rather than just talking about all the ways that
Yeah.
this goes wrong all the time.
Yeah. Ronnie, why don't you help someone? Give someone an idea. What's
Okay.
your favorite idea on this little list we got here?
Well, my favorite idea is I am very WSJF ride or die. I've talked
All right.
about it
What
on
does
this show
WSJF
before.
stand for?
It stands for weighted shortest job first. And it comes from
WSJF.
Agile.
Is that what you call it?
WSJF. People do call
WSJF?
it WSJF.
Really?
Uh-huh.
All right.
Uh-huh. And it comes from Agile. And the point is not to necessarily do it the agile way because that's meant to evaluate like feature requests and things like that.
Yeah, it comes
But
more from like a software development agile background,
exactly.
but
But there's
usable
a
more broadly.
it is and the way that I have used it is here's basically the process that I've used in several different contexts. Like I've used this on an individual level around all of the jobs that I've been doing at various points. And now I'm going to talk about doing it at an organizational level. The first, very easiest part of this is with whatever team at whatever altitude you're working, start with design principles. We've talked about them 1,000 times on this show, but just basically like, if this worked, what would be true? We just need to sort of have something that we're aiming for because it helps figure out the factors that we should solve for. So I made a prioritization rubric at the end of last year that was really useful. And here was the way that we thought about it. Figure out the factors you're solving for. And then basically you have to do a little bit of figuring out of like the weighting of those things. So here's
Mhm.
how I did this not that long ago that I found to be very effective. We created design principles. The team generated a whole ton of possible ideas, like at the priority level, but also really at the project level to get us toward those design principles. And then it was time to evaluate what we were going to actually do because we couldn't do too many. And the rubric that we created, which we followed the WSJF format, but just with different columns basically, rather than shortest and whatever, were
Mhm.
these: short term financial impact, long term strategic impact, feasibility, investment required, and strategic alignment. And we created a definition for each of those, and we created a weighting for each of those. And then for each of the projects, we evaluated them. We scored them against those 5 categories. The way that I set it up was I had each team member score them separately so that there was one
Yeah.
aggregate number. And then you could just sort it. And rather than looking across 50 ideas, that could be prioritized. We sorted it by the weighted score. We picked a cutoff point and we basically said, we're going to do these 10 first. And the other
Yeah.
40, we're going to do later or never.
Yeah.
And like this is imperfect, but even getting into the conversation about what we're designing for and what the variables are is
And what the
more than
weights
I
are.
see a lot of people do. Yeah,
Yeah.
and what the weights
Yeah.
are, and which is actually the most important right now, is
Yeah.
more than I see a lot of people do, and I just find it a way to tame the complexity of, like, we have an opportunity or we have a challenge, no bad ideas in brainstorming, now what?
Yeah. Yeah. And then when whatever kind of rises to the top, it would be interesting if your gut was like, I don't like these. Like, what is it about about this way that we just did it that raised these ones that I'm reacting to? And we can decide, like, all right, is there something that we need to pay attention to in our intuition, or do we trust the process that was pretty logical to have given us a good answer? I think it leads to cool conversations.
And you know what's really interesting, Sam, having done this a bunch of times with a bunch of different teams that I'm on and that I'm working with, it almost always is the inverse of what you just said, which
Okay.
is Um, things we really like are at the bottom.
Yeah.
Like, everybody's a lot of times people's darlings, like, people's ideas that are, like, their perfect little, like, precious
Yeah.
princess ideas do not rise to the top, and that ends up being a really interesting conversation. When it's like
Yeah.
I haven't had the experience yet where the thing that's in the top 3, everybody's like, "Ugh, that's garbage," but I have had the experience where people are like, "Oh, wow, that thing that I thought was really important is last.
Yeah.
Why is
And
that?"
and when I look at my ratings, I even kinda rated it pretty bad. It wasn't just all of you pooped on my
Yes.
idea.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, which is why I think doing something like this, it's like a pretty light lift to get you a
Yeah.
bunch of data.
Yeah. All right. Cool.
All right, what you got?
All right, so we go from the incredibly practical, here's a tool and I'm gonna run you through how to use it, to a philosophical thing.
Love
Let's
it.
say not now instead of no.
Oh,
This has been one that I have used a lot for myself. I think there is a vast psychological gulf between saying I am never or not going to do this thing and I'm not going to do this thing right now.
yeah.
And the result I think is actually the same. You're like not doing the thing in this period of time. Great. Like that's what we're shooting for with prioritization. And if just saying not now is enough to kind of get you over the hump to admit that you're not going to do a thing, then use that as the criteria rather than like, no, we're not going to do this. And what this looks like for me is that I have really robust someday maybe list. It comes from
Uh-huh.
GTD. And the someday maybe list, I will throw things onto, and I have a quarterly rhythm of going back and seeing if I want to rescue anything off of it. But I know that if I'm not going to do a thing and I throw it in the someday maybe list, it's not gone forever. I can always come back to it, but at least it's out of sight for now, and I can focus on the actual priorities. And I think it can work at a more than individual level as well.
I think this is a great one. And, my version of this has been like, let's just pause this for now,
Yeah,
which feels similarly like not like let's kill it. We're
yeah,
not gonna murder it.
totally.
We're just gonna put it to sleep for a little bit.
Yeah. Well, and the
And
funny
that
thing
feels
is too,
better.
I know
It's just
it,
gonna
it
take a
is
little
better,
nap.
and my brain knows this trick. Like my brain knows that not now like really means no. And
Really
even
means
though it
never.
knows it, it still works. It's still
Yeah,
okay with it. And I think my brain
that's
knows like if we pause a thing, we are unlikely to restart it. However,
mhm.
there are enough cases where we do restart a pause thing where my brain can be like, okay, like this is legit. I can let it go.
I love that. That's so funny. It is true. It's like even when we know the tricks, they still work.
Yeah. Brains are
Yeah,
silly like that.
brains are stupid.
Yeah. All right, what do you got? Number 2. Number 2 for you.
Um, we've talked a lot about visualizing work on this show and like using Kanbans, working in public. I still have teams resist this sometimes, which is so hard for me to understand because I just cannot function without
Yeah.
having work in a place that I can see it. I think that, so like, that it's a little bit of a prereq to assume that you believe that in flight work should be written down and visible and shared in a team.
Yeah.
But assuming that you do, I think that like paying particular attention to when things are not updated sort of week on week or in each meeting, and just noticing that not from an accountability perspective and like finger wagging punitive, but just to be like, is this not happening because we don't really care anymore? Because that's
Right.
usually what's going on. Like it usually is low key failed, or it is practically deprioritized, even if it is sunshine zone still prioritized.
Yeah.
And it's like, use that kind of mechanism just to notice what isn't really getting a lot of action, and then propose like tossing that thing into the backlog or into the someday maybe list instead.
Yeah. Totally. I mean, I think what you're pointing to is priorities have often have a way of revealing themselves.
Yes,
And
yes.
if we let them have a way to show us that, and visualizing your work is a great way to see what your priorities actually are. And you may be surprised by what the visualization actually tells you about your priorities.
I think that's exactly right.
I mean, that's what
Yeah.
a calendar is basically, right? Like if you do your calendar is a way of visualizing your work. And if you've ever done kind of an audit of like your last month of your calendar or given somebody else your calendar and asked them like, all right, what do you think my priorities are based on my calendar? Like usually they tell you a thing that you probably are not telling yourself.
Right. I think that's exactly right. It's so interesting. All right,
All
Sam,
right,
bring us home.
last one. So what I have written down here is talk about when priorities are in conflict.
Mhm.
This is a thing that I feel like I've seen very few organizations do well. Worked with various organizations where there are lots of sunshine zone things about what the priorities are, and inevitably, those priorities, when we are trying to work toward them, will come in conflict with each other. And I think if we do not have a practice of like really talking about, hey, this thing that we said is important is coming up against this thing that we said is important. Let's kind of like work through that and figure it out. I think you have created an environment where prioritization or priorities have much less usefulness than they could.
Mhm.
And this is why the idea of the even over I think is really powerful. And I'm realizing I should have written even overs in here as the actual thing, the actual takeaway. But an even over does a good job of pre-committing us to a certain priority. This good thing, this priority, even over this other potential priority. and
Mhm.
landing on even overs that feel toothy and accurate and that a little scary maybe is a way to make priorities come to life and start to navigate those conflicts. I just feel like this comes from having been in too many environments where people are like, there's a lot of back channel conversation about like,
Yeah.
I don't understand. Like I'm being told to do this priority from this VP, and I'm told to do this priority from this VP, and they don't go together.
Which
What
is
am I
it?
supposed to do about that? Yeah,
Right. Right. I love that. Yeah. And I think just the idea of actually having that conversation out loud and transparently
yeah,
is something that I think, to your point, doesn't happen enough and tends to happen in the hallway or in the DM, you
totally.
know?
Because I think there's often like there's like a tinge of like somebody did something wrong or somebody's in trouble because our priorities aren't like lining up. And I think that's an unreasonable expectation to have, a handful of priorities that are purely totally separate from each other in a complex environment. I think it's
Right.
probably more common that we do create conflicts, and that is why I think it is healthier to think about prioritization as this ongoing conversation that we dip into and out of as we need to, rather than this event that we do quarterly or yearly or whenever, where all the prioritization for the entire quarter or the entire year happens, which is just not nonsensical, really, when you think about
It's
how
never going to,
quickly
yeah.
things change.
That feels like a good place for us to wrap. We are always looking for new topics. So if you've got a pattern that you're having trouble changing, email us at podcast@theready.com. This show was engineered by Taylor Marvin and produced by our friend Jack Van Amberg. At Work with the Ready is created by The Ready, where we help organizations around the world change the way that they work. Thank you so much for listening.